Hey everybody, my name is Tyler Cloward. I'm working with Chelsea Miller on this week's subject of the United States Trade Representative and TRIPS. As I got into these subjects a little bit, we were looking at them, and honestly, I didn't even know what they were. And so I got to do a fair bit of research on this to really understand what the trade representative was and really what this agreement on intellectual property. It's new to me to really understand the government's role in all of this. I am a little bit familiar with IP infringement, IP issues. I work in the bicycling industry, and so there are IP issues with designs that we have. A lot of what we do is contract manufacturing with Asia. And so I am a little bit familiar with that on that end, but I wasn't really familiar with the role that the government has. And it was really fascinating to learn really about this and how the government is really helping with all of this. And so the first question that came to mind is really, what is the United States Trade Representative, or the USTR? Really what it is, it's American trade policy towards opening markets throughout the world to create new opportunities and higher living standards for families, farmers, manufacturers, workers, consumers, and businesses. They're trying to figure out how to make international trade work. The United States is party to numerous trade agreements with other countries and is participating in negotiations for new trade agreements with a number of countries and regions throughout the world. Right now, if you're looking at trade, Africa is a huge growing market, and there actually are some new things trying to work with Africa to be able to open new trade routes there. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR, is responsible for developing and coordinating U.S. international trade, commodity, and direct investment policy, and overseeing negotiations with other countries. The head of the USTR is the U.S. Trade Representative, a cabinet member who serves as the president's principal trade advisor, negotiator, and spokesperson on trade issues. The USTR provides trade policy, leadership, and negotiating expertise in its major areas of responsibilities. A lot of these responsibilities, some of them include bilateral and regional and multilateral trade, investment issues, what's happening with investment back and forth, expansion of market access for American goods and service. American goods, are they available in Europe, Asia, Africa? How do they expand that? How do they help with exporting? International commodity agreements, negotiations affecting U.S. import policies. This works with the WTO, other countries. Oversight of the Generalized System of Preferences, the GSP, and complaints against foreign unfair trade practices, as well as import relief cases. So if there is somebody negotiates an IP agreement or something, or a general WTO agreement, the U.S. Trade Representative, their key role is to bring that up. They also handle trade, commodity, direct investment matters managed by international institutions such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. They're at all of these things, so they are pretty busy and do actually have a really big role with trade. They also work trade-related IP protection issues. So what we're going to talk about with TRIPS, that is the trade representative doing that. And again, they're really that go-to contact for the World Trade Organization to really happen to make all the trade work. My real next question was, what happens with trade? How did this come about? Why did it come about? So until the early 1960s, the Department of State was responsible for conducting U.S. trade and investment diplomacy and administering the President's Trade Agreement Program. In the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, Congress called for the president to appoint a special representative for trade negotiations to conduct U.S. trade negotiations. So it was a special rep to really handle that business because it was getting so big and it was really becoming more and more of a world economy. The act provided for the special representative to serve as chair of a new interagency trade organization established to make recommendations to the president on his trade agreement program. The legislation reflected congressional interest in achieving a better balance between competing domestic and international interests in formulating and implementing U.S. trade policy. So as it was becoming more expansive in trade, too much for the president himself to do. So obviously, that's where he has his advisors, and the trade representative really helps in all of the aspect. The trade representative also helps with Congress in advising new trade laws, and what will be the best for the country. Since the 1970s, Congress has gradually and substantially increased the scope of the U.S. Trade Representative. a lot of the things that they really do, now up until this point, they lead responsibility. They have the lead responsibility for developing and coordinating U.S. trade policy and for conducting international trade and trade-related investment negotiations. Designing the trade representative as the principal advisor to the president. We covered that. There's authorization given to the USTR to set U.S. policy on key trade issues, which can become pretty powerful. Congress has made the trade representative the vice chairman of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. They're a non-voting member of the Export-Import Bank Board of Directors and a member of the National Advisory Committee on International Monetary and Financial Policies. Pretty powerful person there. They also act as the principal international trade policy spokesperson of the president. So anytime there's a press having to do with trade, it's usually the USTR taking care of that. They chair the interagency committee that assists and advises the president in developing and implementing U.S. trade policy. They're responsible for leading all trade negotiations on behalf of the U.S. that are conducted under the World Trade Organization. So there again, really anything having to do with the World Trade Organization and the U.S.'s involvement, that is the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative in their office, taking care of those with the WTO. So it is a pretty powerful position. It actually affects quite a bit of us, and really there's a lot of power and a lot of obligation, and really a lot of trust in that office to be able to negotiate new trade. Sanctions are included with that. How are they working with that? Carry out the president's sanctions, deliver those messages. If the U.S. has a different trade policy, there also work internally. How do they expand U.S. exports to other countries and really make them profitable? Can they help educate companies, privately held companies? Can they work with other trade agreements? NAFTA, the TPP, a couple other things. That is all held, and the USTR is really that go-to agency to research those and to advise the president on a lot of those trade agreements. When it comes to that, one of the responsibilities, like I mentioned earlier, is with TRIPS, with intellectual property. So the idea here is finding out a little more of what is TRIPS, and it was one that sort of confused me a little bit after researching. It really makes sense what this really involves. It's really just the TRIPS stands for trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. So, say I'm a business owner, I'm trying to get something new, and I find, offshore manufacturing or something like that. What is happening with my intellectual property of my new widget? Is somebody able to take that? And what if they violate that? What if they steal that idea? And really go from there. Not even here in the U.S., but with other countries. Pretty common example is Honda. Honda, builds motorcycles and things like that, and it was known that there was a Chinese company sort of stealing the Honda name and rebranding it when really the motorcycles weren't Honda quality. They weren't actual things. So the intellectual property in this case is the Honda name, and so that's the same thing that happens, with all of these. Designer fashion or brand names or things like that. You really see this all over the world. If you travel around, you can find Nike and Adidas that aren't really real, but they're using that name. And so what is really happening with these trades, and how is the USTR involved with this intellectual property when it's not used correctly? So with TRIPS, trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, is an international legal agreement between the members of the WTO. So members of the WTO sort of agree with this, hey, at a basic level, we're going to protect intellectual property. Here's what we agree upon, here's how it's going to work, and that's really what the TRIPS agreement is. It establishes the minimum standards for the regulation of many forms of intellectual property by national governments to other World Trade Organization member nations. TRIPS was negotiated at the end of the Uruguay round of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1994. So it's relatively recent that this was really implemented. That everybody agreed, hey, we should probably protect intellectual property rights as technology and IP is becoming more abundant, and we're moving into things like that. And the world has evolved, in what we're building, what we're manufacturing, and what consumers demand. And this is really administered by the WTO. The agreement addresses a few key points. The applicability of the basic trade and tariff laws and those principles and those of relevant international intellectual property agreements. The adequate intellectual property rights, effective enforcement measures for those rights, and the multilateral dispute of settlements. How are they going to, if there is a dispute, how's it going to work? And transitional arrangements. If IP is transitioned, what's going to happen? So why did TRIPS come about? TRIPS came about because it was recognized that widely varying standards existed for the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. The lack of multilateral framework of principles, rules, and disciplines dealing with international trade in counterfeit goods had been a growing source of tension in international economic relations. I've got this great idea, but I don't want to send it out to somebody else because they're going to steal it and remarket it and just take my ideas. Rules and disciplines were needed to cope with these tensions. Governments are getting involved, people are getting mad, by stealing all of these ideas and this intellectual property. How does TRIPS affect trades? TRIPS affects trade by reducing distortions and impediments to international trade, promoting effective and adequate protection of intellectual property rights, and ensuring that measures and procedures to enforce intellectual property rights do not themselves become barriers to legitimate trade. Is my idea, I'm not really, I've got this intellectual property, is this going to be a barrier? Like, I don't trust this country. They're gonna not really hold my IP. They're willing to do that. Am I really willing to trade and work with this country? Or I'm manufacturing it in my own country. Am I willing to send it to them so they can duplicate it? Developing countries responded to the TRIPS agreement by tightening intellectual property protections. They really wanted to say, hey, you know what? We want your product. We're not going to steal it. We're willing to tighten down on that a little bit. This TRIPS agreement has been successful in coercing WTO member countries to strengthen domestic protection of intellectual property rights. WTO member countries often use the agreement as a threat to say, hey, you're not upholding this. We're not willing to do it if you aren't upholding our intellectual property. Negotiated settlements between countries often prevent formal WTO dispute cases. So it is pretty effective of what's happening in this. There are a lot of TRIPS IP dispute cases, a lot of them involving other countries. What is really, really common, actually, one that there are more common things that you see. One that's really big that comes up in the news all the time is what's happening at CES, the big Consumer Electronics Show in Vegas. It's pretty popular that you can come up with this idea. You got this cool new thing. One that was recently, in the last couple of years, was the hoverboard. When the hoverboard became really big, if you followed that at all, there was lawsuits after lawsuit after lawsuit that someone came in from China that had the hoverboard, and this U.S. company was marketing it, and they went and shut them down at their booth. They held people in. They tried to get them, have them arrested on the spot for stealing their intellectual property. Because it had the exact same product debuting at the exact same show, when really there was this new hoverboard thing coming out, but this Chinese vendor had it, as they were way ahead, and so Las Vegas actually sees a ton of international IP disputes because of the CES show. According to the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, Las Vegas hosted more than 23,000 conventions in 2007. This is a little older data. And generating over more than $8 billion in non-gaming revenue for Las Vegas. Many of these conventions included the Consumer Electronics Show, the World Shoe Association, and the Magic Show. These draw exhibitors all around the world, and intellectual property disputes often arise in connection with this trade show. With trademarks, patents, and other IP. Pretty fascinating to think that you wouldn't think about that. Las Vegas is a center to a lot of this. We see a lot of this in banking, actually. With European communities requested, they're working with China and trying to do things with their currency, and what's happening with a lot of the financial institutions. The TRIPS dispute really arises when a member of the government believes another member of government is violating the WTO agreement. The complaining member, they can submit a request for consultation, Currently, right now, as of just a couple of days ago, with the WTO, there's 34 cases cited on their website of disputes with TRIPS and a few things that are happening. And I would encourage you to go look at those. There's actually some fascinating. One of the things that has just come about recently, just in the last day or two, actually involves President Trump. I know we're sort of done hearing about him, but he has one with some IP rights and getting his trademark name in China, which is pretty fascinating. I'll link all of these in the document. I know I'm way over time here, but I'll link these in the document. Go ahead and take a look at those, read a couple of those articles. It was really fascinating. It's a good idea to keep in mind what's happening with this IP, how to protect that, and that there are things in place to protect this sort of commonly across WTO countries. As well as the trade representative working on imports and exports here for the U.S. government. Looking forward to reading your comments and discussions. Maybe we can learn more about this.